Hello, and welcome to Week 2, Unit 3 of Application Development for SAP Business by Design. In this unit, we'll be talking about actions and events, at a high level what they are and what they're used for. So in Unit 1 of this week, we talked about what a business object was, and in the last unit we actually created one. And to do this we used what's called BODL, the Business Object Definition Language. So this is really for defining an object. For actions and events, we're going to use what's called ABSL, the Advanced Business Scripting Language. This is the other set of language that's there in SAP Cloud Application Studio to be able to define actions and behavior that we can associate to particular business objects. Now we can apply ABSL to objects by using these two things, actions and events. Now what are these? Actions can be defined for custom objects or partner objects, as well as standard objects. Now an action is usually something that's specific to one particular object. So for example, a sales order might have consistency check. Is every business object going to have consistency check? Likely no. And so in that case it's an action. It's something that really is relevant only to the sales order. And every object will have its own type of actions. There's many actions that are already there on standard business objects, so even though we can create new ones, obviously there are existing ones. And actions in the SAP Cloud Application Studio do not have import and export parameters. So that means when we call an action on an object, we're not going to pass info into it. Within the action itself, we're actually going to be, if we need any data, we're going to have to go retrieve that data and use it somewhere within our object, on our action. We can trigger actions either from a user interface by clicking a button, from other events, so if an event itself calls an action, other actions. So an action I may have a release for a sales order, which will then also call consistency check to make sure that the sales order is, quote, consistent before it allows the release to happen. So these actions are very useful. We're going to define some. You'll see we'll look at a lot of standard ones. They're really specific to a particular object. Now they're similar but different to what we call events. An event is something that's common across any business object in the application. So actions are specific to one object, events are common to all. They are executed within the life cycle of a particular object. They're predefined by the framework, so we cannot create new events. We can define coding for these events for any business object, whether it's standard or a partner object. But we will never be able to say that here's a new event, unlike actions where we can create a new one. Again, just like actions, events do not have import and export parameters. So if there's any data that we want, we have to pull that into the event ourselves through our own scripting. And as I mentioned, they're all handled by the framework. They're predefined by SAP. They're executed within the framework. So if you defined some type of logic for a particular event, the framework will know and will call it for your object at that specific time. Now, what are the events that are defined today? The first one we'll talk about is after loading. This is an event that's available for only for our partner objects or our custom objects. And in this event, it'll be called as soon as an object is loaded, before, let's say, it's provided, the screen is provided to a particular user to be able to make any changes. So if I have a list view and I click on an element or an object and it's going to load some details page, right before that page is released to the user for changes, the after loading is called. And here we will only be able to modify transient fields. Transient fields are fields that are not persisted in the database. They're only available at runtime, usually just used for some type of administration use, or anywhere where we might need such a type of field that we don't want to persist. And so then in the after loading, we can use this event to modify some transient fields, maybe do some checks when an object is loaded, etc. The next one is the after modify. This happens every time some object is modified. If somebody clicks enter, selects something from a search help, after an action is executed, it'll call the after modify event. This object has not been saved yet, so these changes, you can make changes there. You could even call it web service. You can do just about anything you want to within an after modify event. And this exists for both standard objects and partner objects. The next one we'll look at is before save. Before save is, of course, after a user has clicked save for an object, or maybe an object was created through an integration, and before that object is persisted in SAP Business by Design. The before save will be called, and in here you can again perform any kind of logic or changes you'd like to. There's no restriction to you there. You could call a web service again, do whatever you may want to do, and it exists for both standard objects and for our partner objects. Next is on save, which is a validation. You'll see it's slightly different than the other ones, and in this case the on save is basically a check that happens after the before save, and it gives you a chance to say should this object save or not. You won't be able to change any data, you'll just be able to read data. It also exists for standard and partner objects as well. And you'll notice that this is the one place where we actually have an export parameter. And what it is, we're exporting an indicator field, a boolean, true or false, yes or no. Can we save this object or not? And so we can go and make some kind of check. If you have any kind of validation checks, this would be the place that you probably want to do it. You could run validation checks in, let's say, the after modify. But those would be very strictly enforced, right? That means every modification that somebody does, you're performing that check. Whereas in on save, then you can wait and do your validations all at once at the end once these are done, and that way you allow them to make whatever changes they want, and then it can enforce it before they can actually save the object. Also, the last thing I want to mention is action validations. So for our standard objects, I mentioned that they have their own actions that exist today. And we have the ability to say if those actions should or should not occur. So when a sales order says release, we can do our own checks to say, well, is it allowed for this sales order to be released? Do our own validation first, and then allow the action to continue if we're okay, or to stop it if we're not okay. So these are the different events that exist. Again, these are predefined by SAP. But we can always put scripting in them for a standard object or a partner object. Another thing to mention are reuse libraries. Reuse libraries are the kind of reusable bits of code provided by either SAP or by us as developers. They're from the standard solution. They provide things like currency conversion or unit conversion. Something to get the user's date and time, or the system date time, or UTC date time. There's many existing reuse libraries that we'll be able to use, and we will use. They can be very beneficial to us as developers within our code. Now we can also define our own reuse libraries. We can define whatever we want. This is one place where you will see we do have import and export parameters. So we'll have to pass some type of data to the reuse library, and then we can pass data back. Now, this is the code that we can maintain as developers, or in using reuse libraries, reuse. You'll notice that when we do this, that we won't see, for example, the standard code in the application. We noticed in the repository explorer that we could see the object structure, but we don't see the actual code. They gave us some code samples, but that's absol code or bottle code for us to use in our coding. Let me show you an example here. Let's go back to this repository explorer in the studio. Here we have employee again, and on the root there's the create employee from existing business partner. Now I can select this action. I know it's an action by this little icon where it has a box with a green arrow. It even says sub element type is action in the hover over from my mouse pointer. And I can see details about the action, what it is. It gives me details about the parameters. So if I need to know what type of data I need to pass in or what I might get back from the action, I can see that. But I don't actually see any code here. So that's an important thing about standard actions, is that we don't see the code of the standard objects. We'll talk more about this again in extensibility, but I want to point that out here since we're talking about scripting and coding, etc. So I can see other details. So if I want to know, for example, let's go down and find sales order. As we mentioned, there should be release, or even check consistency, some type of action. I can see if an action exists, if I know that I want to do something around such an action, or what I envision an action might be there. And once I can see it and confirm it, then I can say, okay, let me validate this within my own object. Or from my object, as we said, actions can be called from other actions or even from events. I may want to programmatically call the sales order release action myself from my code in some specific case. So I can see that it is released in the public solution model, and then that lets me know that yes, if I have a sales order instance, I can then call the release action of it. We'll talk more about standard objects and their actions and extensibility at a later point. So that summarizes actions and events. This is really the behavior that we put behind the business objects. Before we define the structure, really what it is, what it represents, now we provide the actual logic and behavior to it. So two different things, we keep them separate, but at least with actions we can create the object-specific behavior, something relevant only to that object, like release of a sales order. And events, we have the predefined events from the framework. The after loading, after modify, before save, validation on save, and then action validation. That's it for this unit. In the next unit, we will actually go ahead and create some scripts ourselves for such actions and events. Thank you.